Martinez had been driving long-haul trucks for 15 years when he encountered something that still makes him check his locks twice before sleeping. It was November 2019, and he was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix along Interstate 40. The weather had turned nasty outside Amarillo, Texas, forcing him to pull into a truck stop for the night. The Flying J was nearly empty, except for a few scattered rigs in the back lot. Danny parked his Peterbilt in a corner spot, away from the main building's lights. He'd done this run dozens of times and knew all the stops, but something felt different that night. The usual chatter on the CB radio had died down to an eerie silence, broken only by occasional static bursts. Around 2 a.m., Danny was settling in for sleep when his CB crackled to life. A voice came through, calm and clear. "Driver in the blue Peterbilt, spot 47. You need to leave, now." Danny sat up, heart pounding. His truck was blue, and he was indeed in spot 47. He grabbed his CB handset. "Who is this? How do you know where I'm parked?" Silence. Then, "There's a man walking toward your truck. He's got something in his hand. Start your engine." Danny peered through his curtains but saw nothing in the darkness. The parking lot appeared empty. "I don't see anyone." "Who are you?" "Look at your passenger side mirror. He's crouched behind the red Freightliner 3 spots down." Danny's blood ran cold. There was indeed a red Freightliner in that exact position. He adjusted his mirror and caught a glimpse of movement. A dark figure hunched behind the other truck. The person appeared to be holding something metallic that glinted in the distant light. The voice returned. "He's been watching you for 20 minutes. Police are 15 minutes out. You need to move to the front of the truck stop near the building." Danny's hands shook as he started his engine. The diesel rumbled to life, loud in the quiet night. As he began to move, he saw the figure stand up and walk quickly toward the building, disappearing into the shadows. He pulled to the front of the truck stop and called 911. When the police arrived, they found tire tracks and footprints around his original parking spot, along with a crowbar left behind near the red Freightliner. The truck's owner was inside the building, asleep, and had no idea someone had been using his rig for cover. But here's where the story becomes truly terrifying. The police checked the truck stop's CB radio logs and surveillance footage. There was no record of anyone using the CB frequencies during that time period. The security cameras showed Danny's truck, the suspicious figure, and the abandoned crowbar, but no other person with a CB radio anywhere in the area. Danny spent the rest of the night in the truck stop's parking lot, surrounded by other drivers who had heard about the incident. He tried repeatedly to reach the mysterious voice that had warned him, but got only static. The next morning, he spoke with several veteran truckers who shared similar stories. Voices on the CB that knew things they shouldn't know, warnings that saved lives, communications that couldn't be explained. One driver, Mike Kowalski, told Danny about an incident in 2010 near Bakersfield, California. Mike had been driving through dense fog when a voice warned him about a multi-car accident ahead. The voice guided him to a safe exit, but when highway patrol arrived, they found no one else in the area with CB equipment. The accident was real. 5 cars had collided in the fog, but Mike avoided it because of the warning. Another trucker, Sarah Chen, reported a similar experience in Montana in 2018. A voice had warned her about a bridge washout on a remote highway during a storm. When she turned around and reported it to authorities, they discovered the bridge had indeed collapsed just hours earlier. But the voice that saved her life couldn't be traced to any known source. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has documented dozens of these cases over the past decade. They call them phantom communications. CB radio warnings that appear to come from nowhere, but provide accurate, life-saving information. The cases all share common elements: isolated truckers, dangerous situations, and mysterious voices that know details they shouldn't know. Danny completed his run to Phoenix, but the experience haunted him. He researched CB radio technology, looking for explanations. Skip propagation can cause distant signals to travel hundreds of miles under certain atmospheric conditions. But that doesn't explain how the voice knew his exact location and the details of his surroundings. He contacted the truck stop's management, hoping to find answers. They told him about Tom Brennan, a longtime trucker who had been murdered in that same parking lot in 2003. Brennan had been known for helping other drivers, often using his CB to warn about road hazards and dangerous areas. He'd been killed during a robbery attempt, his body found near Spot 47. The truck stop manager, Janet Rodriguez, had worked there for 12 years and remembered at least 6 similar incidents. Each time, a lone trucker received a warning about immediate danger from an untraceable CB transmission. Each time, the warning proved accurate. Each time, the voice disappeared once the danger passed. Danny tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe another trucker had seen the suspicious figure and warned him. Maybe the police missed something in their investigation, but the evidence was clear. No one else was there. No other CB transmissions were recorded. Yet he received specific, accurate information that saved his life. The experience changed how Danny approaches his job. He's more cautious about isolated truck stops, more aware of his surroundings. But he also listens more carefully to his CB radio, hoping to hear that voice again. Not because he wants to be in danger, but because he believes someone or something is watching out for truckers on America's highways. The case remains unsolved. The man with the crowbar was never identified, despite clear security footage. The source of the CB transmission remains unknown. Danny continues driving, but he's never parked in Spot 47 again. And late at night, when the highways are empty and the CB is quiet, he sometimes wonders if Tom Brennan is still out there, still trying to keep his fellow truckers safe. The voice in the CB radio became Danny's most terrifying encounter on the road, not because of what it was, but because of what it couldn't be explained to be. Rick Donovan thought he was losing his mind when he first saw her. It was a foggy October night in 2018, and he was hauling refrigerated goods from Denver to Fort Worth, along Highway 287 through the Texas Panhandle. The stretch between Amarillo and Wichita Falls is notoriously desolate, just endless prairie, scattered ranch lights, and the occasional small town that rolls up its sidewalks after sunset. Rick had been driving for 22 years and prided himself on staying alert during the long, monotonous stretches. But around 3 a.m., fighting off fatigue near the tiny town of Childress, he saw something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the road. Standing on the shoulder, illuminated by his headlights, was a young woman in a white dress. She had long, dark hair and was holding what appeared to be a small suitcase. Her thumb wasn't out, but she was looking directly at his truck as he approached. Rick's first instinct was to help. It's dangerous for anyone to be stranded on this remote highway, especially a woman alone at night. He started to slow down, but something stopped him. The woman's dress was pristine white, almost glowing in the darkness. There were no other vehicles in sight, no broken down car on the shoulder. How had she gotten there? And why wasn't she wearing a jacket in the cold October night? As Rick passed her, he checked his mirrors. The woman was gone, completely vanished. No trace of her anywhere on the empty highway behind him. Rick shook his head. attributing it to highway hypnosis, that dangerous state where tired drivers start hallucinating. He'd heard of truckers seeing things that weren't there during long hauls. He grabbed an energy drink from his cooler and cranked up the radio, determined to stay focused. But 20 minutes later, there she was again. Same woman, same white dress, same suitcase. This time she was standing near a mile marker about 15 kilometers ahead of where he'd first seen her. Rick slammed on his brakes, heart pounding. He grabbed his CB radio. "Any drivers on 287 northbound, you copy? This is Big Rick in the blue Kenworth. Anyone else seeing the woman in white out here?" Static filled the cab for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. "You mean Sarah?" "Yeah. She's been walking this highway for about 15 years now. Don't stop for her, driver. Just keep moving." "What do you mean, 15 years? Who's Sarah?" "Sarah Mitchell. Local girl. You new to this route?" Rick had been running this highway for over a decade, but he'd never heard this story. "Tell me." The voice continued. "She was a college student heading home for Christmas break in 2003. Car broke down somewhere between Childress and Quanah around midnight. Instead of staying with her vehicle, she started walking. Trucker found her 3 days later, frozen to death about 10 kilometers from where her car died. Been seeing her ever since." Rick's blood ran cold. He looked ahead and saw the woman again, this time closer to the road. As his headlights hit her, she turned and looked directly at him. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes held a desperate sadness that made Rick's stomach churn. "But that's impossible," Rick radioed back. "I can see her right now. She's real." "Real as anything out here, driver. But she ain't among the living. Most truckers who run 287 regular have seen her. Some more than others. She shows up when the weather's bad, or when someone's in trouble on this stretch." Rick drove past the woman again, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. In his mirror, she was gone once more. He tried to reach the other driver on the CB, but got only static. The next morning, Rick stopped at a truck stop in Wichita Falls and asked around. The older drivers knew the story well. Sarah Mitchell was real. Rick found her obituary online. 20-year-old Texas Tech student died of exposure on Highway 287 during a December blizzard in 2003. Her car had run out of gas, and instead of waiting for help, she'd tried to walk to the nearest town. But the sightings started immediately after her death and continued for years. Dozens of truckers reported seeing a young woman in white along that stretch of highway. The reports were so frequent that local police investigated, thinking someone was playing pranks or that copycat incidents were occurring. In 2009, the Texas Department of Transportation even installed additional emergency call boxes along the route after pressure from trucking companies, whose drivers kept reporting the mysterious hitchhiker. The sightings never stopped. Rick spoke with Martha Hendricks, a veteran dispatcher who'd worked with trucking companies in the area for 30 years. She kept unofficial records of the Sarah Mitchell sightings, over 200 reports from different drivers since 2003. The encounters followed patterns, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always during bad weather, or when other drivers were having emergencies on that stretch of road. Most drivers see her once or twice, Martha explained, but some see her regularly. It's like she chooses certain people, the ones who see her multiple times. They say she's trying to tell them something. Rick didn't want to believe it, but 3 weeks later, he was running the same route when he saw Sarah again. This time, instead of just standing on the shoulder, she was pointing toward a rest area ahead. Rick followed her gesture and found a broken-down pickup truck with a family inside. A father with 2 young children whose vehicle had died in near-freezing weather. Rick called for help and stayed with the family until a tow truck arrived. The father later told him they'd been stranded for over 2 hours, and the children were showing signs of hypothermia. Rick's assistance probably saved their lives. The pattern continued over the following months. Every time Rick saw Sarah, she was directing him toward someone in trouble. A motorcyclist who'd crashed in a ditch, an elderly couple whose car had slid off the icy road, a trucker who'd had a heart attack and managed to pull over before losing consciousness. Rick became one of Martha's regular seers, drivers who encountered Sarah Mitchell repeatedly. He learned to watch for her appearances and follow her guidance. Other truckers on the road began calling him Sarah's driver because word spread about his frequent sightings and rescues. The psychological toll was enormous. Rick started avoiding the route when possible, but his company's contracts required regular runs on 287. He considered changing jobs, but realized that Sarah seemed to use him as a conduit for helping people. The responsibility felt overwhelming. In 2020, Rick had his most disturbing encounter yet. Sarah appeared in his headlights, but this time was frantically waving her arms and pointing ahead. Rick found a massive pileup involving 3 vehicles hidden by fog, an accident that had just occurred. He was able to radio for emergency services and provide first aid until paramedics arrived. 5 people survived because of his early intervention. But that night, for the first time, Sarah didn't disappear when he looked back. She stood by the accident scene until the ambulances arrived, then turned to Rick and nodded before fading away. He hasn't seen her since. Rick still runs Highway 287, but the sightings have stopped. He wonders if Sarah Mitchell finally found peace, knowing that her warnings helped save the lives of strangers traveling the same dangerous road where she died. Or maybe she moved on to work through another driver, continuing her endless vigil along the lonely stretch of Texas highway. The case of Sarah Mitchell remains unexplained. Skeptics attribute the sightings to fatigue, suggestion, and coincidence. But Rick knows what he saw, and more importantly, he knows the lives that were saved because of those impossible encounters. Sometimes, the most terrifying experiences are the ones that force you to question the boundaries between life and death, between the possible and the impossible. On foggy nights when Rick drives through that stretch of Highway 287, he still watches the shoulder carefully, hoping Sarah has found her rest, but ready to help if she calls on him one more time. Jake Morrison still refuses to drive through Nebraska at night. What happened to him on Interstate 80 in March 2021 defies every logical explanation he can think of, and he's spent 2 years trying to rationalize an experience that nearly broke his sanity. Jake was hauling electronics from Sacramento to Chicago, a route he'd driven hundreds of times over his 18-year career. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and he was making good time through the endless Nebraska plains. Around 11 p.m., about 50 kilometers west of Grand Island, he started feeling drowsy and decided to pull into the next rest stop for a power nap. The Platte River Rest Area appeared in his headlights, exactly where it should be, a standard Nebraska Department of Transportation facility with the usual amenities. Jake had stopped there dozens of times before, but as he pulled into the parking area, something felt off. The place seemed unusually quiet, even for a late-night stop. He parked his Freightliner in the truck section and walked to the restroom building. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the concrete walls. The building was empty, which wasn't unusual for this time of night, but Jake noticed that the vending machines were humming louder than normal, an electronic drone that seemed to echo off the walls. After using the facilities, Jake returned to his truck and settled in for a 2-hour nap. He set his alarm for 1 a.m. and closed his eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. The humming from the building seemed to grow louder, almost pulsing, and there was an underlying sound he couldn't identify, like distant voices or radio static. At 12:45 a.m., Jake gave up on sleeping and decided to push through to the next major truck stop. He started his engine and pulled out of the rest area, merging back onto I-80 eastbound. The digital clock on his dashboard read 12:47 a.m. as he accelerated back to highway speed. But 15 minutes later, Jake saw the familiar blue sign, Platte River Rest Area, 1 mile. His heart skipped. That was impossible. He'd just left that rest stop and had been driving east for over 15 minutes. There was no way he could be approaching it again. Jake pulled over and checked his GPS. According to the device, he was exactly where he should be, about 65 kilometers east of where the rest stop should be located. But the sign was real, and ahead in his headlights, he could see the same rest area he'd just left. Confused but curious, Jake pulled into the facility again. Everything looked identical. Same building, same parking layout, same flickering lights. But now there were other vehicles, a red pickup truck, a white sedan, and a motorcycle parked near the building. Jake hadn't seen any of these vehicles during his first stop. He walked to the building again, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. Inside, he found 3 people. An elderly man washing his hands at the sink, a middle-aged woman buying coffee from a vending machine, and a young motorcyclist studying a road map under the harsh fluorescent lights. Jake approached the elderly man. "Excuse me, but how long have you been here?" The man looked up with confused eyes. "I'm not sure. I stopped to rest, but I can't seem to find the exit back to the highway. Every time I try to leave, I end up back here." The woman overheard and turned around. "You too? I've been trying to get back on the interstate for over an hour. My GPS keeps saying I'm in the right place, but the on-ramp just leads me in a circle." The motorcyclist joined the conversation. "Same here. I've tried leaving 3 times. I keep ending up back in this parking lot. It's like this place won't let us go." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He checked his phone. No signal. The woman tried hers with the same result. The elderly man said his cell phone had stopped working the moment he'd pulled into the rest area. "What time did you all arrive?" Jake asked. "Around midnight," the woman replied. "Same here," said the motorcyclist. "Maybe 11:45. The elderly man nodded. "Just before midnight." Jake looked at his watch. 1:23 a.m. According to his timeline, he should have been driving for over 30 minutes since leaving this place the first time. But here he was, back where he started, with 3 other people who claimed to be trapped in the same loop. They decided to leave together, following each other in a convoy. Jake led in his truck, followed by the pickup, the sedan, and the motorcycle. They drove toward the on-ramp, merged onto what appeared to be I-80 eastbound, and drove for exactly 12 minutes before seeing the same blue sign, Platte River Rest Area, 1 mile. This time, Jake didn't stop. He drove past the exit, but the highway ahead simply ended in darkness. Not construction barriers, not a road closure, just absolute blackness where the pavement should continue. Jake slammed on his brakes and looked in his mirrors. The other vehicles had stopped behind him, their headlights illuminating nothing but void. With no choice but to turn around, the convoy returned to the rest area. This time, they all gathered in the building to discuss their situation. The elderly man, who introduced himself as Henry, had been a long-haul trucker for 40 years before retiring. The woman, Carol, was a nurse driving home from a conference. The motorcyclist, David, was a college student heading back to school. None of them could explain what was happening, but they all agreed on the basic facts. They'd arrived around midnight. Their phones had no signal, and every attempt to leave led them back to the same rest area. The building's clocks had stopped at 11:59 p.m., and their watches seemed to be running normally, but time felt distorted. Henry suggested they wait until dawn, thinking that daylight might break whatever was trapping them. But hours passed, and the sky remained dark. Jake's watch showed 4:30 a.m., but there was no hint of sunrise on the horizon. At 5:15 a.m. by Jake's watch, Carol made a disturbing discovery. She'd been keeping a written log of their experiences, noting the time of each escape attempt. According to her notes, they'd tried to leave 17 times over the past 5 hours, but Jake could only remember 5 or 6 attempts. David found something even more unsettling. He'd been taking photos with his phone's camera. The device worked fine except for the cellular and GPS functions. When he showed them the pictures, they revealed impossible images. The rest area building appeared different in each photo, sometimes larger, sometimes with different architectural details. And in some pictures, there were people in the background that none of them remembered seeing. By 6 a.m., panic was setting in. Henry suggested they try leaving in different directions. Maybe only the eastbound ramp was affected. Carol tried the westbound entrance, while David attempted to drive cross-country through the prairie grass. Both returned within minutes, reporting that their routes had somehow curved back to the rest area parking lot. Jake decided to try something different. Instead of attempting to leave by vehicle, he walked to the edge of the rest area property and kept going on foot. He walked what felt like several kilometers into the Nebraska grassland. But when he looked back, the rest area building appeared to be the same distance away as when he'd started. When he tried to return, he found himself back at the parking lot within minutes, even though the walkout had taken much longer. At 7:22 a.m., something changed. The humming from the building stopped abruptly, and Jake's phone showed a single bar of signal. The other travelers' devices came back online simultaneously. Carol's GPS started working again, showing their correct location on I-80. They decided to leave immediately, before whatever had trapped them could resume. This time, when they drove toward the on-ramp, the highway continued normally into the distance. Jake's convoy reached Grand Island without incident, and they all parted ways at a truck stop, exchanging contact information and promising to stay in touch. Jake completed his run to Chicago, but the experience haunted him. He researched the Platte River rest area and found something disturbing. The facility had been closed for renovation from February 15th to March 30th, 2021. According to the Nebraska Department of Transportation, the rest area should have been completely inaccessible during Jake's March 18th experience. He contacted Carol and David, who confirmed they'd had the same realization. Henry's phone number was disconnected, and attempts to trace him through trucking companies came up empty. It was as if Henry had never existed. Jake drove past the Platte River rest area several times over the following months, during different times of day and night. The facility appeared normal, with regular traffic and functioning amenities, but he never stopped there again. In September 2021, Jake received a call from Carol. She'd been researching their experience and found online forum posts from other travelers describing similar incidents at various rest stops across the Midwest. The stories followed the same pattern: nighttime arrivals, technological malfunctions, inability to leave, and encounters with other trapped travelers who couldn't be traced afterward. The most disturbing discovery was a post from 2019 describing an identical experience at the Platte River rest area. The author mentioned being trapped with an elderly trucker named Henry and 3 other people. But when Jake tried to contact the forum user, the account had been deleted. Jake still drives I-80 through Nebraska, but only during daylight hours. He's never seen the mysterious Henry again, and sometimes wonders if the old trucker is still trapped in that impossible loop. helping other lost travelers cope with their terrifying situation. The Platte River Rest Area appears on every map and GPS system, operating normally according to all official records. But Jake knows that some places exist in the spaces between reality, and sometimes travelers find themselves caught in those spaces with no explanation and no easy way out. The experience taught Jake that the highways he'd traveled for decades still held mysteries that defied logic, and that some rest stops offer anything but rest for the weary traveler. Marcus Thompson learned to fear his own rearview mirror during a nightmare run through Montana in December 2020. What started as a routine haul from Seattle to Minneapolis became a psychological nightmare that still makes him question what's real and what isn't on America's loneliest highways. Marcus was hauling medical supplies in his red Kenworth, fighting through a brutal snowstorm on Interstate 94 near the North Dakota border. Visibility was near zero, and he was crawling along at barely 40 kilometers per hour when he noticed headlights in his mirrors. Another truck had pulled up behind him, matching his speed exactly. At first, Marcus was relieved. Convoy driving in bad weather was common sense. Truckers looking out for each other on dangerous roads. The truck behind him appeared to be a dark-colored Peterbilt, though the snow made it difficult to see clearly. Marcus tried reaching the driver on CB Channel 19. "Driver in the dark, Pete behind me, you copy? This is Red Dog in the red Kenworth." No response. Marcus tried again on channels 17 and 21, but got only static. He wasn't too concerned. Maybe the other driver's radio was broken, or he was focused on the treacherous driving conditions. For the next hour, the Peterbilt stayed exactly 50 meters behind Marcus, never getting closer, never falling back. When Marcus slowed down for particularly bad patches of road, the truck behind him slowed down. When Marcus sped up slightly, the Peterbilt matched his speed perfectly. The driver's dedication to maintaining that precise distance was impressive, but also oddly unsettling. Around 2 a.m., Marcus pulled into a truck stop near Miles City to fuel up and grab coffee. The storm was getting worse, and he needed a break from the white-knuckle driving. As he pulled into the diesel lanes, he checked his mirrors for the Peterbilt, expecting to see it follow him into the truck stop. The truck wasn't there. Marcus looked around the parking lot, thinking maybe the driver had chosen a different entrance or was parking elsewhere. But the truck stop was nearly empty. Just his Kenworth, 2 other rigs parked far from the fuel island, and a few cars near the building. The dark Peterbilt that had been following him for over an hour had simply vanished. Marcus fueled up and went inside for coffee, asking the clerk if he'd seen another truck pull in recently. The young man behind the counter, who had a clear view of the entire lot, said no other trucks had arrived in the past 2 hours. Confused but not alarmed, Marcus returned to his truck and merged back onto I-94. The storm was still raging, but visibility had improved slightly. Within 10 minutes of leaving the truck stop, the headlights appeared in his mirrors again. Same truck, same following distance, same perfect synchronization with his driving. This time, Marcus was determined to make contact. He tried every CB channel, used his air horn to signal the truck behind him, and even flashed his brake lights. No response. The Peterbilt continued its robotic following pattern, maintaining that exact 50-meter distance no matter what Marcus did. As dawn approached, the storm began to clear, and Marcus could see the truck behind him more clearly. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Peterbilt appeared to be in perfect condition. No road salt, no snow buildup on the cab or trailer, no ice on the windshield. It looked like it had just driven off a dealer's lot, despite spending hours in the same blizzard that had covered Marcus's truck with ice and grime. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Marcus couldn't see a driver. The cab appeared empty. No silhouette behind the wheel, no movement in the driver's seat, nothing to indicate a human presence. Yet the truck continued following him with mechanical precision, responding to every change in his speed and direction. Marcus pulled over at the next rest area, his hands shaking as he parked. He watched in his mirrors as the Peterbilt stopped exactly 50 meters behind him, on the shoulder. Marcus sat in his cab for 10 minutes, waiting to see if a driver would emerge from the mysterious truck. Nothing. The Peterbilt sat motionless, engine running, but no one got out. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and walked back toward the truck, his boots crunching in the snow. As he got closer, he could see that the cab was indeed empty. The driver's seat was vacant, and there was no one visible in the sleeper berth. But the engine was running, the headlights were on, and the truck showed no signs of damage or malfunction. When Marcus reached the passenger side and tried to look through the window, something impossible happened. The truck slowly began moving forward, even though there was clearly no one behind the wheel. Marcus jumped back as the Peterbilt pulled back onto the highway and resumed its position, 50 meters behind his parked Kenworth. Marcus ran back to his truck and called 911, but his cell phone had no signal in the remote area. He tried his CB radio, desperately calling for any driver who might be in the area. Finally, a trucker about 30 kilometers ahead responded. "This is Moondog eastbound on 94. Go ahead, Red Dog." "Moondog, I need you to do me a favor. I'm being followed by a driverless truck. I know how that sounds, but I need you to watch for us when we pass your location. Dark Peterbilt, about 50 meters behind a red Kenworth." "Copy that, Red Dog. I'll keep an eye out." Marcus pulled back onto the highway, and the Peterbilt immediately resumed following him. 20 minutes later, Moondog's voice crackled over the CB. "Red Dog, I see your Kenworth passing my location now. But brother, there's no truck behind you. Your trailer's clear, and I don't see any other headlights in either direction." Marcus checked his mirrors frantically. The Peterbilt was still there, maintaining its perfect following distance. "Moondog, are you sure? I'm looking at it right now in my mirrors." "Red Dog, I'm looking right at you through my windshield. You're running solo out there." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Moondog insisting he saw only Marcus's truck, while Marcus could clearly see the Peterbilt following him. They arranged to meet at the next truck stop to figure out what was happening. At the truck stop, Marcus pulled into a parking space and watched the Peterbilt park 50 meters away in an empty area of the lot. Moondog pulled in a few minutes later and walked over to Marcus's truck. "Where's this phantom truck you were talking about?" Moondog asked. Marcus pointed to the Peterbilt. "Right there. Dark blue Pete, about 6 years old." Moondog looked in the direction Marcus was pointing and saw nothing but empty pavement. "There's nothing there, brother. Just snow and parking lot." Marcus stared at the truck that was clearly visible to him, but apparently invisible to everyone else. He walked toward the Peterbilt with Moondog following, describing what he was seeing. To Marcus, the truck was solid and real. He could hear its engine running and see exhaust coming from its stacks. To Moondog, Marcus appeared to be walking toward and describing empty air. The situation became even more bizarre when Marcus reached out to touch the truck. His hand passed through what appeared to be solid metal. The Peterbilt was there, but it wasn't physically present in any way that mattered. Moondog, a veteran driver with 30 years of experience, had seen highway hallucinations before. Truckers who'd been driving too long sometimes saw things that weren't there. But Marcus had just started his shift after a full night's sleep, and his descriptions were too detailed and consistent for typical fatigue-induced visions. They agreed that Marcus should follow Moondog for the rest of the trip, hoping that the presence of another truck would make the phantom Peterbilt disappear. But when they returned to the highway, the mysterious truck resumed its position 50 meters behind Marcus, invisible to Moondog, but clear as day in Marcus's mirrors. The convoy arrangement worked for about an hour, until Moondog had to exit for his delivery in Fargo. As soon as Marcus was alone again, he noticed something new about his phantom follower. The Peterbilt was slowly getting closer. Instead of maintaining its 50-meter distance, it was now about 40 meters back, and the gap was continuing to close. Over the next several hours, as Marcus drove through Minnesota, the phantom truck crept steadily closer. 30 meters, 20 meters, 15 meters. Marcus could feel his sanity fraying as the impossible vehicle continued its relentless approach. He tried driving faster, but the Peterbilt matched his speed. He tried slowing down, but it maintained the same decreasing distance. By the time Marcus reached the Twin Cities, the phantom truck was directly behind his trailer, so close that any normal driver would be tailgating dangerously. Marcus could see details he'd missed before. The truck had no license plates, the windows were completely black, and there were no company logos or identification markings anywhere on the cab or trailer. Marcus made his delivery in Minneapolis and immediately drove to a truck stop to rest and try to process what had happened. As he parked, the phantom Peterbilt pulled up beside him in the adjacent space. For the first time in over 12 hours, Marcus couldn't see anyone or anything in the cab. It appeared completely empty and silent. Marcus spent the night in his sleeper berth, but couldn't sleep. Every time he looked out his window, the phantom truck was there, dark and motionless. Around 6 a.m., he decided to start his return trip to Seattle, hoping the phantom would disappear once he left the area. But as soon as Marcus pulled out of the truck stop, the Peterbilt started following him again. This time, it stayed directly behind his trailer, matching his every move with impossible precision. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Marcus felt like he was being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. The return trip became a blur of terror and exhaustion. The phantom truck followed Marcus across Minnesota, through the Dakotas and into Montana. Other drivers on the CB couldn't see it, rest stop cameras didn't record it, and way station officers looked at Marcus strangely when he mentioned being followed by a driverless truck. Only when Marcus crossed into Washington State did the Peterbilt finally disappear. He was climbing through the Cascade Mountains when he realized his mirrors showed only the normal traffic behind him. The phantom convoy had ended as mysteriously as it had begun. Marcus never drove that route again. He requested different assignments and eventually left long-haul trucking altogether, taking a local delivery job that kept him close to home. He researched phantom vehicle sightings and found dozens of similar reports from drivers across the country. Mysterious trucks that followed them for hundreds of kilometers before vanishing without explanation. The most disturbing discovery was a forum post from 2018 describing an identical experience on I-94 in Montana. The driver reported being followed by a dark Peterbilt that gradually moved closer over several hours before disappearing near the Washington border. The post was dated exactly 2 years before Marcus's encounter, and the details matched perfectly. Marcus still wonders if the phantom truck is still out there, waiting for another lone driver to follow through the Montana snow, getting closer and closer until... what? He never wants to find out, and he's never driven I-94 through Montana again. Some roads, Marcus learned, have their own rules about who travels them and what follows behind in the darkness. Tommy Vasquez thought he was having the worst night of his career when his GPS failed on a remote stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada. What he discovered over the next 8 hours made him question everything he thought he knew about time, space, and the roads that connect America's loneliest places. It was August 2019, and Tommy was hauling construction equipment from Las Vegas to Denver on what truckers call the loneliest road in America. Highway 50 cuts through the Nevada desert for hundreds of kilometers with almost no civilization. Just sagebrush, mountains, and endless asphalt stretching toward the horizon. Around 11 p.m., somewhere between Ely and Austin, Tommy's GPS screen went black. He tried restarting the device, checking connections, even switching to his backup navigation system, but nothing worked. All his electronic equipment seemed to be functioning normally, except for GPS. No signal, no satellite connection, nothing. Tommy wasn't too concerned at first. He'd driven this route many times and knew the highway was basically a straight shot, with few turns or exits. He could navigate by mile markers and road signs until he reached the next town, where he could get his GPS repaired. But as he continued driving east, Tommy began noticing something strange about the mile markers. Instead of increasing as he traveled toward Denver, they were decreasing. Mile marker 127 was followed by 126, then 125. Tommy figured he'd gotten turned around somehow and was accidentally heading west toward California. He pulled over and studied his compass. The needle clearly pointed east. He was driving in the correct direction, but the mile markers continued counting down. 124, 123, 122. Tommy had never seen anything like it in 23 years of driving. Tommy tried his CB radio to contact other drivers, but got only static. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote area. He decided to keep driving until he reached a town or found another truck to ask for directions. For the next hour, the mile markers continued their backward countdown. Tommy passed marker 95, then 85, then 70. According to his odometer, he'd driven over 60 kilometers, but the markers suggested he was moving backward through space rather than forward. At mile marker 50, Tommy saw something that made him slam on his brakes. In his headlights stood a hitchhiker, a middle-aged man in work clothes holding a cardboard sign. But as Tommy got closer, he realized the man wasn't casting a shadow, despite being directly illuminated by the truck's powerful headlights. Tommy rolled down his window. "You need a ride, buddy?" The man looked up with eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. "You're going the wrong way," he said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away. "Turn around before you reach mile marker 0. "What happens at mile marker 0? The man pointed down the highway. "You'll see, but you won't be able to come back." Before Tommy could ask what that meant, the hitchhiker stepped backward into the darkness and vanished. Tommy got out of his truck and searched the area with his flashlight, but found no trace of the man. The desert around the highway was flat and open. There was nowhere for someone to hide. Shaken but curious, Tommy continued driving. The mile markers kept counting down. 35, 30, 25. Each marker seemed to glow slightly in his headlights, as if lit from within. Tommy noticed that the stars overhead were brighter than normal, and the desert landscape looked somehow different, more colorful, more alive, as if he was seeing it through a different kind of light. At mile marker 10, Tommy's truck began experiencing problems. The engine started running rough, his headlights dimmed, and the radio filled with strange interference. Voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, mixed with what sounded like music from decades past. The speedometer needle began fluctuating wildly, showing speeds that ranged from 0 to over 150 kilometers per hour, even though Tommy was maintaining a steady pace. Mile marker 5 appeared in his headlights, and Tommy felt a growing sense of dread. The hitchhiker's warning echoed in his mind. "Turn around before you reach mile marker 0. But Tommy was a stubborn man, and his curiosity overrode his fear. He had to know what happened at mile marker 0. Mile marker 3 was followed by a section of highway that looked different from the rest. The asphalt appeared newer, almost reflective, and the yellow lines seemed to glow with their own light. Tommy's truck felt like it was floating rather than driving. The usual vibrations and road noise had disappeared. Mile marker 1 stood alone in a stretch of desert that looked like it belonged on another planet. The sagebrush had given way to strange plants that Tommy didn't recognize, and the mountains in the distance appeared to be moving, shifting shape like living things. Then Tommy saw mile marker 0. It was larger than the other markers, made of what looked like black metal that absorbed his headlights rather than reflecting them. As Tommy approached, his truck began to slow down on its own, as if the engine was fighting against his commands. The marker seemed to pull at his vehicle like a magnet. Tommy stopped his truck about 10 meters before the marker and got out to investigate. The marker was unlike anything he'd ever seen, perfectly smooth, with no manufacturing marks or installation hardware. The number 0 seemed to be carved into the metal, but the cuts were so deep they disappeared into darkness. As Tommy stood there, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. But when he looked back down the highway, he saw something impossible. A convoy of trucks was approaching from the west, the same direction he'd come from. But these weren't modern trucks. They looked like vehicles from the 1950s and 1960s, complete with the styling and paint schemes of those eras. The lead truck pulled up beside Tommy's rig and stopped. The driver rolled down his window, an elderly man wearing clothes that matched his vintage truck. "You picked a bad night to get lost, son," the old driver said. "This stretch of road don't follow the same rules as the rest of the highway." "What do you mean?" Tommy asked. "Mile marker 0 is the end of the line. Cross it, and you'll be driving in circles forever, just like us. We've been trying to find our way back to the real highway for, well, time don't work the same way here." The old driver gestured to the other trucks in his convoy. "Jimmy there has been driving since 1963. Says he was hauling cattle to Denver when he got turned around on this same stretch. Maria's been here since the 1980s. Computer malfunction led her off the main road. We're all trying to find our way home." Tommy looked at the other trucks and their drivers. Each vehicle was from a different era, and the drivers all had the same lost, desperate look in their eyes. They'd been trapped on this impossible stretch of highway for decades, maybe longer. "How do I get back to the real road?" Tommy asked. "Turn around now, before midnight," the old driver replied. "After midnight, the highway rearranges itself, and you'll be stuck here with us. We tried to warn others, but most don't listen. They drive past mile marker 0 and disappear into whatever's on the other side." Tommy looked at his watch. 11:47 p.m. He had 13 minutes to escape whatever was happening on this stretch of Highway 50. He thanked the old driver and ran back to his truck. As Tommy turned his rig around, he noticed that the mile markers had changed again. Instead of counting up from 0 as he headed west, they were now counting down from a number so high he couldn't read it in the darkness. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into black void rather than meeting the horizon. Tommy drove as fast as his truck would go, watching his clock count down the minutes until midnight. At 11:58, he passed a mile marker that read, the infinity symbol. At 11:59, his headlights illuminated a marker that showed numbers constantly changing, cycling through random digits too fast to read. At exactly 12 a.m., Tommy's truck crossed an invisible boundary, and suddenly, everything returned to normal. His GPS flickered back to life, showing his correct location on Highway 50. The mile markers resumed their normal eastward progression. His radio picked up a clear signal from a truck stop dispatcher in Ely. Tommy pulled into the first truck stop he found and spent the rest of the night researching his experience. He discovered dozens of reports from drivers who'd gotten lost on remote stretches of Highway 50 experiencing everything from GPS failures to encounters with vehicles from other time periods. The Nevada Department of Transportation had no record of mile marker zero, and maps showed no gaps or irregularities in the highway's numbering system. But Tommy found something else. Missing person reports for truckers who'd vanished while driving Highway 50 over the decades. Drivers whose trucks were never found, whose last known locations were somewhere between Ely and Austin. The dates of their disappearances matched the time periods of the trucks Tommy had seen in the Phantom convoy. Tommy completed his run to Denver, but never drove Highway 50 alone again. When he had to take that route, he traveled during daylight hours and always with another truck for company. He tried several times to find mile marker zero again, but could never locate the exact spot where he'd had his encounter. Sometimes, late at night when he's driving other lonely highways, Tommy wonders if those lost drivers are still out there, trapped on an impossible stretch of road that exists between the mile markers of reality. And he wonders what would have happened if he'd driven past mile marker zero into whatever lies beyond the edge of America's loneliest road. The experience taught Tommy that some highways lead to destinations that don't exist on any map, and that the numbers on mile markers don't always count in the direction you'd expect. In the vastness of the American West, where roads stretch for hundreds of kilometers through empty desert, it's possible to drive off the edge of the known world and find yourself on a highway that follows rules older and stranger than human understanding. Ray Kowalski discovered that some roads exist in two places at the same time during what should have been a routine overnight haul from Phoenix to Albuquerque in October 2020. What started as a simple GPS glitch turned into a nightmare that made him question the very nature of reality on America's interstate system. Ray had been driving the same route on Interstate 40 for 12 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture between Arizona and New Mexico. He knew every truck stop, every rest area, and every landmark along the way. The 700-kilometer journey usually took him about 8 hours, including stops for fuel and food. On this particular night, Ray was making good time through the Arizona desert when his GPS began acting strangely around 2 a.m. Instead of showing his position on I-40, the device displayed two parallel highways running side by side. One showed his truck's icon moving normally along the familiar route, while the other showed an identical highway running parallel to it, about a kilometer to the south. Ray assumed it was a mapping error or satellite interference, but as he continued driving, he noticed something disturbing in his side mirrors. There was another highway visible in the distance, running parallel to I-40. Ray had driven this route hundreds of times and had never seen a second highway in that location. He pulled over at the next rest area and studied the terrain with binoculars he kept in his cab. Sure enough, there was a highway running parallel to I-40, complete with mile markers, guardrails, and what appeared to be traffic. But according to every map Ray had ever seen, there should be nothing but desert in that direction. Ray tried his CB radio to ask other drivers about the mysterious highway, but the responses he got were confusing. Some drivers insisted there was no parallel road, while others confirmed they could see it too. The strangest part was that drivers who could see the duplicate highway all reported seeing the same thing: traffic moving in the opposite direction from the vehicles on I-40. Curious and slightly unnerved, Ray decided to investigate. He found a dirt road that seemed to lead toward the parallel highway and carefully drove his truck across the desert terrain. The road was rougher than he expected, but after about 10 minutes of slow driving, he reached what appeared to be an on-ramp to the duplicate highway. The road surface looked identical to I-40, same asphalt, Same lane markings, same reflective paint. Even the mile markers matched the ones on the main highway. But as Ray merged onto this duplicate road, he immediately noticed something wrong. The traffic was moving in the wrong direction. Every vehicle on the duplicate highway was traveling west toward Arizona, even though Ray was driving east toward New Mexico. Semi-trucks, cars, motorcycles, all heading the opposite direction from where they should be going. But when Ray checked his compass, it clearly showed he was still traveling east. Ray tried his CB radio again and managed to contact another trucker on the duplicate highway. The conversation that followed made no sense. Eastbound driver in the white Freightliner, this is Desert Rat in the blue Peterbilt. Where are you headed? I'm going to Denver, came the reply. Should be there by morning if this weather holds. Ray looked around. The night was clear with no weather issues. What weather? It's clear out here. Clear? Brother, I'm driving through the worst sandstorm I've seen in 20 years. Can barely see 50 meters ahead. Ray could see the white Freightliner clearly about a quarter kilometer ahead of him. The truck was driving in bright moonlight with perfect visibility. There was no sandstorm anywhere. The conversation continued with each driver describing completely different weather conditions and destinations, even though they were supposedly on the same highway. The other driver insisted he was on I-25 heading north through Colorado, while Ray's GPS clearly showed both trucks on a duplicate version of I-40 in Arizona. Over the next hour, Ray encountered more vehicles on the duplicate highway, and each conversation revealed the same pattern. Every driver believed they were on a different road, traveling to different destinations, experiencing different weather conditions. But Ray could see them all clearly, driving in the same direction he was, on what appeared to be an exact copy of I-40. The most disturbing discovery came when Ray passed a rest area on the duplicate highway. The facility looked identical to the Meteor Crater rest area on I-40, complete with the same buildings, parking layout, and signage. But the people using the rest area were different. Ray could see families, truckers, and travelers who looked like they were from different time periods. Some were dressed in clothing from the 1980s, others from the 1990s. Their vehicles matched their apparent time periods. Older car models, vintage trucks, even some vehicles Ray hadn't seen on the road in decades. But all these people and vehicles appeared solid and real, not ghostly or transparent. Ray parked at the duplicate rest area and approached a family loading luggage into a station wagon that looked like it was from 1987. When he tried to speak to them, they looked right through him as if he wasn't there. He could see them clearly and hear their conversations, but they couldn't see or hear him. A trucker from the 1990s was refueling a truck that Ray recognized as a model that had been discontinued for 15 years. Ray tried to communicate with the driver, but got the same result. The man couldn't see or hear him, even when Ray was standing right next to him. Ray realized he was somehow existing in a parallel version of the rest area, able to observe the people from different time periods, but unable to interact with them. The implications were terrifying. Was he stuck in some kind of temporal duplicate of I-40, watching echoes of travelers from the past? Ray returned to his truck and continued driving on the duplicate highway, hoping to find a way back to the real I-40. But every exit ramp he tried led to empty desert or looped back to the same highway. His GPS continued showing two parallel roads, but now Ray couldn't tell which one was real and which was the duplicate. Around 5 a.m., Ray encountered something that nearly made him lose his sanity. In the distance, he could see his own truck approaching from the opposite direction. Not a similar truck, his exact truck, same model, same paint job, same company logos. As the truck got closer, Ray could see himself behind the wheel, looking confused and frightened. The duplicate Ray was driving in the opposite direction, apparently seeing the same things the real Ray was experiencing. When the trucks passed each other, both versions of Ray stared at each other in shock. The duplicate Ray looked exactly like him, wearing the same clothes, even had the same expression of bewildered terror. Ray tried to follow his duplicate, but the truck disappeared around a curve and never reappeared. Ray drove for another hour, searching for any sign of his other self or a way off the duplicate highway. His fuel gauge was running low, and he was beginning to panic. Just as the sun began to rise, Ray spotted something that gave him hope. A sign reading, "Return to I-40, next exit." The exit ramp appeared normal, leading away from the duplicate highway toward what looked like the real desert landscape. Ray took the exit without hesitation. The ramp led to a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. Ray drove for 20 minutes across increasingly rough terrain before finally seeing the familiar landmarks of the real I-40 in the distance. When he reached the highway and merged back into normal traffic, his GPS immediately returned to showing a single road. Ray completed his delivery in Albuquerque, but couldn't stop thinking about his experience. He researched duplicate highway sightings and found scattered reports from drivers across the country describing similar encounters. Most were dismissed as hallucinations caused by fatigue or medical conditions. But Ray found one detailed account from a driver in 2003 who described almost exactly the same experience on I-40 in Arizona. The driver reported seeing a parallel highway populated by vehicles and people from earlier time periods, and even encountering his own duplicate driving in the opposite direction. Ray drove the I-40 route dozens more times over the following months, always watching for signs of the duplicate highway. He never saw it again, but sometimes, late at night when he's driving through the Arizona desert, he wonders if there's another version of himself out there, still trapped on that impossible parallel road, trying to find his way back to reality. The experience taught Ray that America's highway system might be more complex than anyone imagines, that some roads exist in multiple versions simultaneously, each populated by travelers from different times and places. And somewhere out there, on a highway that looks exactly like I-40, but isn't quite the same, there might be duplicate versions of every driver who's ever gotten lost in the vastness of the American Southwest. Ray still drives long-haul routes, but he's more careful about trusting his GPS and more aware of the roads that run parallel to his route. Because sometimes, Ray learned, the highway you're driving on isn't the only version of that highway that exists, and taking the wrong exit might lead you to a road where you meet yourself coming the other way. Brian Matthews learned that some way stations measure more than just the weight of your cargo during a haul from Portland to Salt Lake City in September 2021. What happened at a routine inspection stop on Interstate 84 in Oregon changed his understanding of what government facilities actually monitor on America's highways. Brian was hauling computer equipment in his silver Mack truck, running slightly behind schedule due to construction delays near the Dalles. It was around 10 p.m. when he saw the familiar blue sign. All commercial vehicles must stop. Way station 2 miles. Brian had been through this particular way station dozens of times over his 15-year career and knew the routine by heart. But as he approached the facility, something seemed different. The usual floodlights that illuminated the way station were dimmer than normal, casting strange shadows across the inspection bays. The electronic signs that typically displayed open or closed were completely dark, showing no information at all. Brian pulled into the right lane and slowed down as he approached the scales. The weigh station appeared to be open. There were other trucks ahead of him going through the inspection process. But the facility looked older than he remembered, with equipment and signage that seemed outdated by at least 20 years. A uniformed officer waved Brian onto the scales. The man was wearing what appeared to be a standard Department of Transportation uniform, but something about him seemed off. His movements were too precise, almost robotic, and his face showed no expression, despite the late hour and obvious fatigue that Brian himself was feeling. "Step out of your vehicle and bring your logbook and registration," the officer instructed in a monotone voice. Brian complied, grabbing his paperwork from the cab. As he walked toward the inspection office, he noticed that the other trucks going through the weigh station were all older models, trucks from the 1990s and early 2000s that he rarely saw on the road anymore. The drivers looked tired and confused, moving through the inspection process like sleepwalkers. Inside the inspection office, Brian was directed to a counter where another officer began examining his documents. The office looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Old computers with CRT monitors, filing cabinets that belonged in a museum, and fluorescent lights that flickered constantly. "Purpose of your trip?" the officer asked, even though this information was clearly documented in Brian's logbook. "Delivering computer equipment to Salt Lake City," Brian replied. The officer typed something into his ancient computer, the keys clicking loudly in the quiet office. "How long have you been driving this route?" "About 8 years, regularly." "Have you noticed any changes in your sleep patterns? Unusual dreams? Memory gaps?" Brian was taken aback by the odd questions. In 15 years of trucking, no DOT officer had ever asked him about his sleep or dreams during a routine inspection. "No, nothing like that." "Is there a problem with my paperwork?" The officer didn't answer, continuing to type on his computer. The screen was angled away from Brian, but he could catch glimpses of what appeared to be a detailed form with hundreds of fields, far more complex than any DOT inspection form he'd ever seen. "Have you experienced any lost time while driving? Periods where you can't remember how you got from one location to another?" "What kind of questions are these? I just need to get my truck weighed and continue to Salt Lake City." The officer looked up for the first time, and Brian noticed something disturbing about his eyes. They were completely black. No iris, no pupil, just solid black orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Please answer the questions, Mr. Matthews." Brian felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't given the officer his name, and the man hadn't looked at his driver's license or registration closely enough to read it. "How do you know my name?" "It's on your paperwork," the officer replied, but Brian could see his documents sitting untouched on the counter. Brian looked around the office and noticed that the other drivers who had been there when he arrived were gone. He was alone with the strange officer, and the office suddenly felt much larger than it had when he'd entered. The walls seemed to stretch away into darkness, and the fluorescent lights were dimming. "I think there's been a mistake," Brian said, reaching for his paperwork. "I need to get back on the road." The officer's hand shot out with inhuman speed, grabbing Brian's wrist. The grip was ice cold and impossibly strong. "The inspection isn't complete. We need to examine your cargo." Brian tried to pull away, but the officer's grip tightened. "My cargo? It's just computers. They're all documented and sealed." "Not that cargo," the officer said, his voice taking on an electronic quality, as if it was being processed through some kind of synthesizer. "The cargo you're not aware you're carrying." Brian managed to break free from the officer's grip and ran toward the door. But when he reached what should have been the exit, he found himself in a long corridor lined with metal doors. The corridor stretched into darkness in both directions, with no sign of the way out. Behind him, Brian could hear the officer's footsteps, but they sounded wrong, like metal clicking against concrete rather than shoe leather. Brian ran down the corridor, trying door after door, but they were all locked. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a sound like machinery humming to life. Finally, Brian found an unlocked door and burst through it, expecting to find himself outside near his truck. Instead, he was in another room filled with monitoring equipment. Dozens of screens showing highways from aerial views, with individual vehicles highlighted and tracked. Brian recognized some of the roads as routes he traveled regularly. A technician in a white coat looked up from one of the monitors. Like the officer, his eyes were completely black. Subject 447 has become aware of the monitoring process, he said into a headset microphone. Subject 447? Brian asked. What are you talking about? The technician pointed to one of the monitors showing Interstate 84. A silver truck was highlighted with a tracking indicator, and data was streaming across the screen. Coordinates, speed, route history, and dozens of other parameters Brian couldn't understand. Your truck has been equipped with monitoring devices for the past 3 years, the technician explained in the same emotionless tone as the officer. Every route you drive, every stop you make, every conversation you have is recorded and analyzed. Brian stared at the screen showing his truck. According to the display, the vehicle was currently stationary at the weigh station, but the data showed impossible readings. Negative fuel consumption, speeds exceeding any truck's capabilities, and locations that included coordinates for places that shouldn't exist. This is insane, Brian said. You can't just monitor people without their consent. This is illegal. Consent was obtained through your participation in the highway system, the technician replied. Every time you use an interstate highway, you agree to monitoring for national security purposes. Brian tried to process what he was hearing. National security? I haul computer equipment and furniture. What possible national security interest could there be in monitoring me? The technician turned back to his monitors. Some cargo moves itself. Some routes exist only when needed. Some drivers carry passengers they never see. The highway system serves purposes beyond transportation. On one of the screens, Brian saw something that made his blood run cold. The monitor showed the interior of his truck's cab, with a clear view of the driver's seat. But sitting in the passenger seat was a figure Brian had never seen before. A person in dark clothing, whose face was obscured by shadows. Who is that? Brian demanded. Your passenger. It's been riding with you for approximately 18 months. Most monitored drivers are unaware of their passengers. Brian remembered the DOT officer's questions about memory gaps and lost time. Over the past year and a half, he had experienced periods where he couldn't quite remember portions of his drives, stretches of highway that seemed to pass in a blur, rest stops he couldn't recall visiting, conversations on the CB radio that felt like dreams. What does it want? What is it doing in my truck? That information is classified above your clearance level, the technician said. Please return to your vehicle and continue your route. The monitoring will continue as scheduled. Brian ran from the room, desperately searching for an exit from the impossible facility. He found himself in a maze of corridors and rooms, filled with equipment he didn't recognize. Devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a highway weigh station. Finally, Brian saw a sign pointing toward Vehicle Exit and followed it down a long ramp. He emerged into what appeared to be the normal weigh station parking area, with his truck sitting exactly where he'd left it. But the facility around him looked different again. Newer, brighter, with modern equipment and normal-looking DOT officers processing other trucks. Brian approached his truck cautiously and looked through the passenger window. The seat appeared empty, but he could see a slight indentation in the cushion, as if someone had been sitting there. He climbed into the cab and immediately drove away from the way station, not stopping until he reached a truck stop 50 kilometers down the highway. At the truck stop, Brian searched his truck thoroughly, looking for any monitoring devices or signs of tampering. He found nothing obvious, but discovered that his CB radio had been preset to channels he'd never used, and his GPS showed recent destinations he didn't remember visiting. Brian tried to report his experience to the Department of Transportation, but when he described the way station, officials told him there was no such facility at that location on Interstate 84. According to their records, the nearest way station was over 100 kilometers away, and it had been closed for renovation during the time Brian claimed to have been there. Brian completed his delivery to Salt Lake City, but couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Over the following weeks, he noticed strange details during his drives. Vehicles that seemed to follow him for unusually long distances, rest stops with equipment he didn't recognize, and CB radio conversations that cut off abruptly when he tried to join them. Most disturbing were the memory gaps that seemed to be getting worse. Brian would start driving through a familiar section of highway and find himself hundreds of kilometers further along his route, with no memory of the intervening time. His logbooks showed entries he didn't remember making, documenting stops at facilities he'd never heard of. Brian eventually left long-haul trucking and took a local delivery job that kept him off the interstate highways. He never encountered the mysterious way station again, but he kept researching similar experiences online. He found scattered reports from drivers describing identical encounters, way stations that didn't appear on maps, officers with black eyes asking strange questions, and monitoring equipment that seemed far too advanced for routine commercial vehicle inspections. The most disturbing discovery was a forum post from a driver who claimed to have worked for a government contractor installing monitoring equipment in commercial vehicles. According to the post, thousands of trucks were equipped with devices that did far more than track location and speed. They monitored the driver's biometric data, recorded conversations, and could even influence behavior through subsonic frequencies. Brian never learned the truth about what happened to him at the way station that doesn't exist. But he knows that America's highway system hides facilities and purposes that go far beyond what the public realizes, and that some of the trucks sharing the road with everyday drivers are carrying cargo and passengers that exist in the shadows between the official world and something far stranger. Steve Chen discovered that some highways have memory when he took on a rush delivery from Memphis to Atlanta in November 2022. What started as overtime pay for driving a route he'd never been on before became a journey through echoes of traffic accidents that happened decades ago, forcing him to relive the final moments of drivers who never made it home. Steve had been driving regionally for 8 years, mostly familiar routes through Tennessee and Kentucky. But when his dispatcher offered him double pay to cover a last-minute delivery on Interstate 78 through Alabama, he couldn't refuse. The route would take him through some of the most remote sections of highway in the South, but the money was too good to pass up. The trouble started around midnight as Steve drove through a particularly desolate stretch of I-78 near the Alabama-Georgia border. His CB radio began picking up what sounded like emergency communications, panicked voices calling for help, dispatchers coordinating rescue vehicles, and the controlled chaos of accident response. But when Steve looked around, the highway was empty except for his truck. "This is Unit 47. We have a multi-vehicle accident at mile marker 156, requesting ambulance and fire rescue," came a clear voice over his radio. Steve checked his location He was approaching mile marker 156, but there was no accident, no emergency vehicles, no other traffic at all. The highway stretched empty in both directions, under the dim moonlight. "Anyone copy that emergency traffic?" Steve called on his CB. "This is Big Steve eastbound on 78. Not seeing any accident at marker 156. Silence. Then, a different voice responded. "Big Steve, this is Rescue Command. What's your 20? "I'm right at mile marker 156 on I-78 eastbound. Everything looks clear out here." "Negative, Big Steve. We show no emergency units in that area. Are you sure about your location?" Steve was certain of his position, but the emergency chatter continued on his radio. He could hear paramedics requesting life flight helicopters, fire crews calling for heavy rescue equipment, and a constant stream of urgent communications about an accident that wasn't there. As Steve drove past mile marker 156, the radio traffic suddenly stopped. The CB went completely silent, not even the usual static or distant conversations that fill the airwaves on most highways. Steve tried calling other trucks, but got no response. It was as if every radio in the area had been switched off simultaneously. 10 kilometers further down the highway, the emergency chatter started again. This time, the voices were different, but the content was similar. A major accident, multiple casualties, emergency vehicles rushing to respond. The location was mile marker 162, exactly where Steve was approaching. But again, when Steve reached the specified location, there was no accident. The highway was empty, the asphalt unmarked by any recent crash. Yet the radio continued broadcasting detailed emergency communications about victims trapped in vehicles, medical helicopters inbound, and a traffic closure that clearly wasn't in effect. Steve pulled over at the next rest area and tried to make sense of what he was hearing. He researched the emergency frequencies on his phone and discovered something disturbing. The radio traffic he was picking up was being broadcast on frequencies that had been discontinued years ago. The call signs and communication protocols were from the 1990s and early 2000s. Steve found something even more unsettling when he searched for accident histories on I-78. At mile marker 156, there had been a fatal multi-vehicle accident in 1998, exactly the type of crash described in the radio traffic he'd heard. At mile marker 162, a similar accident had occurred in 2003, with details that matched the second set of emergency communications. According to news reports, both accidents had involved multiple fatalities and had required extensive emergency response efforts. The radio traffic Steve was hearing appeared to be recordings or echoes of the actual emergency communications from those crashes, somehow still being broadcast decades later. As Steve continued his drive, the pattern repeated every few kilometers. His radio would pick up emergency chatter, describing accidents that had happened years or decades ago at specific mile markers. Each set of communications was historically accurate, describing real crashes that Steve could verify through online accident reports and news archives. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Steve felt like he was driving through a graveyard of highway tragedies, listening to the final moments of emergency responders, trying to save lives that had been lost years before he'd ever driven this route. The voices on the radio were filled with urgency and hope, unaware that their efforts were already part of history. At mile marker 178, the radio crackled with a familiar voice. "This is Big Steve in the blue Peterbilt, requesting immediate assistance. My truck's jackknifed and I'm trapped in the cab. Can anyone hear me?" Steve's blood went cold. That was his own voice calling for help, but he was driving normally with no problems. He looked around frantically, but saw no other truck, no accident, no signs of distress. Yet his own voice continued broadcasting a desperate plea for rescue. "Big Steve, this is Highway Patrol. We're en route to your location. Can you describe your injuries?" "I think my legs are pinned," his own voice responded. "There's smoke coming from the engine. I need help fast." Steve pulled over and got out of his truck, checking his CB radio. The device was working normally, receiving the transmissions but not broadcasting them. Yet he could clearly hear his own voice continuing the emergency conversation, describing injuries he didn't have and a crash that wasn't happening. Steve searched online for accident reports at mile marker 178 and found nothing recent. But buried in archived news reports from local papers, he discovered something that made him question his sanity. In 2019, a truck driver named Stephen Chen had been killed in a jackknife accident at mile marker 178 on I-78. The driver had been trapped in his cab and died before rescue crews could free him. The news report included a quote from the emergency radio transcripts. "This is Big Steve in the blue Peterbilt, requesting immediate assistance. My truck's jackknifed and I'm trapped in the cab." Steve stared at the news report on his phone. Stephen Chen, the same last name as his own, the same CB handle, even the same truck description. But the accident had happened 3 years before Steve had ever driven this route, and he was very much alive. Steve tried calling his dispatcher to report the situation, but his phone had no signal in the remote area. He returned to his truck and continued driving, hoping to reach a cell tower and get help understanding what was happening. But the radio continued broadcasting emergency communications from his own future death. "Big Steve, fire rescue is on scene. We're going to get you out of there. I can't feel my legs anymore. The smoke's getting thicker. Hang in there, Big Steve. We're almost through the door." Steve listened to his own final moments playing out on the radio, conversations he'd never had about an accident that hadn't happened to him. The emergency responders' voices grew more urgent as they realized they were losing the race against time to save a driver who shared his name and call sign. The broadcast ended with a paramedic's voice. "Time of death, 2:47 a.m. Steve looked at his clock, 2:47 a.m. In that moment, Steve felt a strange disconnection from reality. Was he still alive and driving toward Atlanta? Or had he died in 2019 and was somehow experiencing an echo of his own accident? Was the highway playing back recordings of past tragedies? Or was he trapped in some kind of temporal loop? Steve pinched himself, checked his pulse, even slapped his own face to confirm he was conscious and alive. Everything felt real. The steering wheel in his hands, the vibration of the engine, the cool night air through his cracked window. But the radio had just announced his death with perfect accuracy about events that had supposedly happened years ago. As Steve approached mile marker 185, his radio picked up a new set of emergency communications. This time, the voices were describing a different type of accident, a car that had hit a deer and rolled into a ditch. The driver was a woman named Sarah, and the communications described her rescue in detail. Steve searched for accident reports at that location and found the exact scenario described in a news article from 2001. Sarah Martinez had been killed when her car struck a deer at mile marker 185, exactly as described in the radio traffic. Steve realized that I-78 was somehow recording and replaying the emergency communications from every fatal accident that had ever occurred along its length. The highway had become a repository of final moments, broadcasting the desperate attempts to save lives that were already lost. But his own death was different. Steve was alive and driving, yet the highway was playing back emergency communications from an accident that had supposedly killed someone with his exact name and circumstances in 2019. Was the highway predicting future tragedies? Or was Stephen Chen from 2019 a different person entirely? Steve never found a satisfactory answer. He completed his delivery to Atlanta and never drove I-78 again. He researched the Stephen Chen who had died in 2019 and found only a brief obituary with no photo, a truck driver with no listed family or background information. Steve changed his CB handle and tried to forget the experience, but he never could. Sometimes, late at night when he's driving other routes, he wonders if highways everywhere are recording the final moments of drivers who don't make it home. And he wonders if somewhere on I-78, his own voice is still calling for help in an accident that either happened 3 years before he was there or is waiting to happen to him in the future. The experience taught Steve that some roads remember everything that happens on them, storing the echoes of human tragedy in ways that defy explanation. And sometimes, those echoes include events that haven't happened yet, or that happened to someone who shares your name, but may never have existed at all. Eddie Rodriguez discovered that some truck stops exist in pockets of time that don't move forward when he pulled into what appeared to be a normal travel center on Highway 285 in New Mexico during a blizzard in January 2023. What he thought would be a quick fuel stop and coffee break became a 12-hour nightmare that lasted only 20 minutes in the real world. Eddie was hauling frozen goods from Albuquerque to Denver, fighting through one of the worst winter storms he'd seen in his 19 years of driving. Visibility was near zero, and his fuel gauge was approaching empty when he spotted the familiar glow of a truck stop ahead. The sign read, Desert Springs Travel Center, fuel, food, lodging, a place Eddie had never noticed before despite driving this route monthly for over a decade. The parking lot was nearly full, which surprised Eddie given the dangerous weather conditions. Most smart drivers would have already found shelter hours ago, rather than continuing to travel in such conditions. But Eddie was grateful to see other trucks. It meant the facility was open and operational. Eddie parked next to a red Freightliner and walked toward the main building, fighting against the wind and snow. Inside, the travel center looked typical. Bright fluorescent lighting, shelves stocked with snacks and trucker supplies, a small restaurant area, and a counter where a middle-aged woman was serving coffee to several drivers. But something felt off about the place. The drivers sitting at the restaurant tables looked exhausted, beyond normal road fatigue. They moved slowly, spoke in whispers, and kept checking their watches with expressions of growing anxiety. The woman behind the counter had a forced smile that never reached her eyes. Eddie grabbed a cup of coffee and approached the counter. "Terrible weather out there," he said to the woman. "Yes, it's been like this for quite some time," she replied in a flat, monotone voice. "How long will you be staying?" "Just long enough to fuel up and grab some food. Should be back on the road in 30 minutes. The woman's smile flickered. "I'm afraid it might be longer than that." Eddie paid for his coffee and walked over to the restaurant area where several drivers were sitting. He recognized one of them, Mike Santos, a driver he'd met at various truck stops over the years. "Mike, what are you doing here? I thought you were running the West Coast exclusively now." Mike looked up with hollow, tired eyes. "Eddie, when did you get here?" "Just now. How long have you been here?" Mike checked his watch, confusion spreading across his face. I'm not sure. I stopped for fuel around 8 p.m., but my watch says it's still 8:15. That can't be right." Eddie looked at his own watch. 8:17 p.m. He'd been in the travel center for at least 10 minutes, but according to Mike, only 2 minutes had passed since he'd arrived at 8 p.m. "Maybe your watch stopped," Eddie suggested. "That's what I thought, but look around. Everyone's watch shows the same time." Eddie asked the other drivers at nearby tables to check their watches. Every single timepiece, watches, phones, truck dashboard clocks, showed times between 8 o'clock and 8:20 p.m. But the drivers themselves claimed to have been at the travel center for hours. One driver, an elderly man named Frank, said he'd been there since early afternoon. I stopped for lunch around 2 p.m., but my watch still shows 2:15. I've eaten 3 meals since then, walked around the building dozens of times, even tried to sleep in my truck. But time isn't moving forward. A younger driver named Lisa showed Eddie her logbook. According to her entries, she'd been at the travel center for over 8 hours, documenting multiple fuel stops, meals, and rest periods. But her truck's electronic logging device showed she'd only been there for 15 minutes. Eddie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Has anyone tried to leave? The drivers exchanged nervous glances. Frank spoke up. We've tried, but something always happens to bring us back. Trucks won't start, roads are blocked, or we just end up back here without remembering how. Eddie decided to test this for himself. He walked outside to his truck, but found that his keys weren't in his pocket. He searched everywhere. His cab, the ground around the truck, even retraced his steps to the building. The keys had simply vanished. Inside the travel center, Eddie asked the woman behind the counter if anyone had turned in lost keys. She smiled that same artificial smile. I'm afraid all vehicles must remain parked until conditions improve. What conditions? It's just snow. I've driven in worse weather than this. Time conditions, she replied, as if that explanation made perfect sense. Eddie tried using his cell phone to call for help, but the device showed no signal despite normally having good coverage in this area. The other drivers reported the same problem. Their phones worked for everything except making calls or accessing the internet. As Eddie spent more time in the travel center, he began noticing disturbing details. The food in the restaurant never ran out, no matter how much the drivers ate. The coffee pot was always full, the hot dogs on the roller grill never decreased in number, and the ice cream freezer remained perfectly stocked. The woman behind the counter never seemed to eat, drink, or take breaks. She stood in the same position for hours, serving customers with the same mechanical smile. When Eddie tried to engage her in conversation about anything other than the travel center, she would respond with non sequiturs or simply repeat previous statements. Most disturbing was what happened when drivers tried to sleep. Frank had attempted to rest in his truck multiple times, but every time he woke up, he was back inside the building with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The same thing happened to other drivers who tried to leave the main area. They would walk toward the exit and somehow find themselves back at the restaurant tables. Eddie decided to conduct an experiment. He asked all the drivers to synchronize their watches to 8:30 p.m., then observe what happened over the next hour. They sat together in the restaurant area, watching their timepieces and documenting everything they experienced. According to their watches, a full hour passed. They ate meals, had conversations, played cards, and even watched a movie on the travel center's television. But when they checked their watches again, they all still showed 9:30 p.m. Time had stopped moving forward, but they were still experiencing duration and sequence of events. Lisa, who had a background in physics before becoming a trucker, tried to explain what might be happening. It's like we're in a temporal bubble. Time is passing subjectively. We're aging, thinking, experiencing. But objective time isn't advancing. We're stuck in a loop that repeats the same 20-minute period. But why? Eddie asked. What's keeping us here? Frank had a theory. I've been thinking about this for however long I've really been here. This travel center wasn't here last month when I drove this route. I remember this stretch of highway. There was nothing but desert. No buildings, no exits, nothing. Eddie realized Frank was right. He'd driven Highway 285 monthly for years and had never seen this travel center before tonight. But now it seemed like it had always been there, complete with aged signage and worn pavement that suggested decades of operation. Mike made another disturbing observation. Look at the other customers. Eddie looked around the travel center and noticed something he'd missed before. Besides the drivers at the restaurant tables, there were other people in the building. Customers browsing the aisles, families with children, elderly couples. But these people never spoke, never made purchases, and never seemed to acknowledge the driver's presence. When Eddie tried to approach one of these phantom customers, they would move away without seeming to notice him. They appeared solid and real, but existed in the space without interacting with anything or anyone. They were like background actors in a play, filling the scene but serving no purpose. Eddie began to suspect that the travel center was some kind of trap, designed to capture travelers during dangerous weather conditions. But for what purpose? The facility didn't seem to be run by criminals or government agents. It felt more like a place that existed outside normal reality, operating by rules that had nothing to do with human understanding. Around what should have been midnight by Eddie's internal clock, something changed. The lights in the travel center began to flicker, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The phantom customers started moving more erratically, walking in circles or standing motionless for long periods. The woman behind the counter's smile finally faded, replaced by an expression of mechanical concentration. She began typing on a computer that Eddie was certain hadn't been there before, entering data at inhuman speed. Frank grabbed Eddie's arm. This happened before. Every few hours, something resets. The phantom people disappear. The woman does whatever she's doing with that computer, and then everything starts over with new phantom customers. What happens to us during the reset? We stay aware, but everything else changes. It's like watching the same movie over and over, but we remember all the previous showings. As Eddie watched, the phantom customers began fading away like ghosts, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. The woman finished her typing and looked up at the drivers with an expression that was no longer human. Her eyes had become solid black, like those of a shark. Reset initiated, she announced in a voice that echoed through the building. Stand by for temporal recalibration. The lights went out for exactly 3 seconds. When they came back on, the travel center was populated with a completely different set of phantom customers. The woman was back to her artificial smile, and all the clocks had reset to 8:00 p.m. But this time, something was different. Eddie found his truck keys in his pocket. When he went outside, his truck started normally, and the snowstorm had stopped. The highway was clear, and Eddie could see normal traffic in the distance. Eddie didn't hesitate. He climbed into his truck and drove away from the travel center as fast as he could. In his rearview mirror, he watched the building's lights fade into the distance. When he looked at his dashboard clock, it showed 8:23 p.m., only 3 minutes after he'd first arrived. Eddie completed his delivery to Denver and immediately researched the Desert Springs Travel Center. According to online maps and business directories, no such facility existed on Highway 285. The GPS coordinates where he'd stopped showed only empty desert, with no record of any commercial development. Eddie tried to contact the other drivers he'd met at the travel center, but found no trace of them. Mike Santos, Frank, and Lisa appeared to exist only in trucking company databases as drivers who had vanished during winter storms over the past several years. Their trucks had been found abandoned on various highways, but the drivers themselves were never located. Eddie realized he'd escaped from a place that collected lost travelers, trapping them in temporal loops while feeding off their time and experiences. The phantom customers were probably previous victims who had been completely absorbed by whatever force operated the facility. But Eddie's escape came with consequences he didn't immediately understand. Over the following weeks, he began experiencing strange side effects from his time at the Desert Springs Travel Center. His internal clock seemed permanently damaged. He would feel like he'd been driving for hours, only to discover that minutes had passed, or think he'd taken a quick nap and wake up to find he'd lost an entire day. More disturbing were the temporal echoes. Eddie would catch glimpses of the travel center in other truck stops, brief flashes where the normal facility would flicker and show the Desert Springs layout. The woman with the artificial smile would appear behind counters for split seconds before being replaced by normal employees who seemed unaware anything had happened. Eddie contacted a retired physicist named Dr. Margaret Chen, who had written papers about temporal anomalies and missing time incidents. When Eddie described his experience, Dr. Chen revealed that she'd been documenting similar cases for over 20 years. "You're describing what we call a temporal sinkhole," Dr. Chen explained during their phone conversation. "Places where time pools and eddies instead of flowing normally. They seem to appear during severe weather events when electromagnetic fields are disrupted." Dr. Chen had files on dozens of missing travelers who had last been seen during storms, only to have their vehicles found days later with mysterious fuel consumption patterns and electronic malfunctions. Some had been missing for weeks, but their truck's electronic logs showed only hours of operation. "The really disturbing cases," Dr. Chen continued, "are the drivers who escape these temporal sinkholes but bring something back with them. Passengers that show up on security cameras, but whom the drivers can't see or remember." Eddie felt a chill. He asked Dr. Chen to explain further. "Check your truck's cabin cameras if you have them. Look for anomalies, shadows that don't match your position, reflections that show extra occupants, anything that suggests you're not alone in your cab." That night, Eddie reviewed his truck's security footage from the past month. What he found made him consider abandoning trucking altogether. In dozens of recordings, there was a shadowy figure sitting in his passenger seat, the same type of phantom customer he'd seen at the Desert Springs Travel Center. The figure appeared to be watching Eddie, sometimes leaning forward as if speaking, though Eddie had no memory of conversations with any passenger. Most disturbing was that the shadow seemed to be growing more solid with each passing day, as if it was slowly manifesting into physical reality. Eddie called Dr. Chen again and described what he'd found. Her response was grim. "You've brought one of them back with you. The temporal entities that run these facilities sometimes attach themselves to escapees. They're trying to use you as an anchor to exist in normal time." Dr. Chen explained that these shadow passengers would gradually drain their host's life force while becoming more real themselves. Eventually, the host would fade away while the entity took their place completely. Identity, memories, even physical appearance. "There are ways to break the connection," Dr. Chen said, "but they're dangerous and not always successful. The entity will fight back when it realizes what you're trying to do." The process Dr. Chen described involved returning to the exact spot where Eddie had encountered the temporal anomaly and performing a ritual designed to sever the connection. But this meant deliberately seeking out the Desert Springs Travel Center during another storm, risking being trapped again permanently. Eddie had another option, living with the shadow passenger and slowly fading away over several months until the entity completely replaced him. Dr. Chen estimated he had perhaps 6 weeks before the transformation would be irreversible. Eddie chose to fight back. He spent 3 weeks monitoring weather patterns across New Mexico, waiting for another severe storm to hit the Highway 285 corridor. When meteorologists predicted a major blizzard for the region, Eddie loaded his truck with supplies and drove toward the area where he'd first encountered the travel center. The storm was worse than the previous one, with visibility near zero and dangerous wind conditions. But Eddie was determined to find the Desert Springs Travel Center and confront whatever force was slowly stealing his identity. As expected, the travel center appeared during the height of the storm, glowing through the snow exactly as it had before. But this time, Eddie was prepared. Following Dr. Chen's instructions, he carried a series of mirrors designed to reflect temporal energy and a device that generated specific electromagnetic frequencies. Inside the travel center, Eddie found the same scene as before: drivers trapped in temporal loops, phantom customers moving through their routines, and the woman behind the counter with her artificial smile. But now, Eddie could also see the shadow passengers attached to each trapped driver, feeding off their time and gradually replacing them. The woman behind the counter recognized Eddie immediately. "You've returned, but you've brought unauthorized equipment." Eddie activated Dr. Chen's device, filling the travel center with a high-pitched electromagnetic pulse. The phantom customers began flickering and fading, and the trapped drivers looked around in confusion, as if waking from a deep sleep. "You cannot break the temporal matrix," the woman said, her voice becoming distorted and electronic. "The entities require completion of their manifestation cycle." Eddie used the mirrors to redirect the temporal energy flowing through the building, creating feedback loops that disrupted the facility's operation. The lights began strobing, and the clock started spinning wildly through different times. But the shadow passenger attached to Eddie fought back, attempting to gain full control of his body. Eddie felt his consciousness being pushed aside as the entity tried to complete its takeover. For several terrifying minutes, Eddie experienced his own thoughts and memories being overlaid with those of the shadow passenger, a being that had been trapped in temporal loops for decades, desperate to exist in linear time again. The battle for control of Eddie's identity lasted until the electromagnetic pulse reached critical frequency. The temporal matrix collapsed, and every entity in the facility was suddenly expelled back to whatever dimension they had originated from. Eddie found himself alone in the travel center, which was now showing signs of rapid decay. The building aged decades in minutes. Paint peeling, fixtures corroding, furniture crumbling. Eddie ran to his truck and drove away as the facility collapsed behind him. When Eddie checked his security cameras later, the shadow passenger was gone. Dr. Chen confirmed that the electromagnetic pulse had successfully severed the connection, but warned that Eddie might experience residual effects for months. Eddie did experience strange symptoms: occasional time slips where he would lose minutes or hours, glimpses of the travel center overlaying normal truck stops, and dreams where he was still trapped in the temporal loop. But gradually, these effects faded. Eddie never drove Highway 285 alone again, and he always made sure to fuel up before entering remote areas. He sometimes wonders if the Desert Springs Travel Center is still out there, waiting for the next storm to bring it new customers who will discover that some stops on America's highways exist outside the normal flow of time, where minutes can last forever and forever can pass in an instant. But now he also knows that escaping such places is only the beginning of the danger, and that some passengers follow you home long after you think you've reached safety. Carlos Mendez learned that not all roads lead somewhere when his GPS malfunctioned during a delivery run from Phoenix to El Paso in April 2022. What started as a simple detour to avoid construction became a journey into a section of interstate highway that exists on every map, but leads to places that shouldn't be possible in the American Southwest. Carlos was hauling auto parts in his black Volvo truck, running slightly ahead of schedule on Interstate 10. Near Tucson, Electronic signs warned of a major accident ahead, with delays of several hours. Carlos's dispatcher recommended taking State Route 86 south to Interstate 19, then connecting back to I-10 near the Mexican border, a detour that would add only an hour to his trip. But as Carlos followed his GPS onto what should have been Route 86, he noticed something strange. The road surface was perfect, too perfect for a state highway that typically saw heavy truck traffic. The asphalt was smooth and unmarked, the lane lines were brilliantly white, and there wasn't a single pothole or crack anywhere. More disturbing was the landscape. Carlos had driven through southern Arizona dozens of times and knew the terrain well. Desert scrub, scattered mountains, and the occasional small town. But the land around this highway looked different. The desert was too green, too lush, with plants that Carlos didn't recognize, despite being a native of the region. After driving for 30 minutes, Carlos expected to see signs for the connection to Interstate 19. Instead, he saw a green highway sign that read, Interstate 86 West, Las Vegas, 450 kilometers. Carlos pulled over and checked his maps. There was no Interstate 86 in Arizona, and the route he was taking should have been heading east toward I-19, not west toward Nevada. Carlos tried his CB radio to contact other truckers, but the airwaves were completely silent. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in remote areas, but his GPS was still working and confirmed he was on Interstate 86 West. According to the device, this highway existed and connected Arizona to Nevada through a route Carlos had never heard of. Confused but not alarmed, Carlos continued driving, hoping to find an exit where he could turn around or at least ask for directions. But for the next hour, he encountered no exits, no side roads, no buildings, nothing but perfect highway stretching through impossible landscape. The desert around Interstate 86 was unlike anything Carlos had ever seen. Instead of the typical brown and tan colors of Arizona, everything was tinged with an odd blue-green hue that seemed to come from the plants themselves rather than from atmospheric effects. The saguaro cacti were taller than normal and appeared to be growing in perfectly straight lines along the highway. Around noon, Carlos saw something that made him question his sanity. In the distance, rising from the desert floor, was a city. Not a small town or trading post, but a full-sized metropolitan area with skyscrapers, sprawling suburbs, and what appeared to be millions of lights, even in broad daylight. Carlos checked his GPS, but the device showed no cities in this area. According to every map he'd ever seen, there should be nothing but empty desert for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. Yet ahead of him was unmistakably an urban center, larger than Phoenix or Tucson. As Carlos approached the city, he saw an exit sign. New Esperanza, population 2.4 million. Next 3 exits. Carlos had lived in Arizona his entire life and had never heard of New Esperanza. A city of 2.4 million people would be the largest in the state, impossible to hide or overlook. Carlos took the first exit, hoping to find someone who could explain where he was and how to get back to a familiar route. The off-ramp led to a surface street that looked like it belonged in a major metropolitan area. 6 lanes, professional signage, well-maintained landscaping. But as Carlos drove into New Esperanza, he realized something was terribly wrong. The city was completely empty, not just quiet or sparsely populated, completely devoid of people, vehicles, or any signs of life. The buildings were intact and appeared recently constructed. Streetlights were functioning, traffic signals were operating normally, and landscaping was perfectly maintained. But there wasn't a single person anywhere. No pedestrians on the sidewalks, no cars in the parking lots, no movement behind the windows of the office buildings. Carlos parked his truck in front of what appeared to be a shopping mall and got out to investigate. The mall's doors were unlocked, and inside he found a fully operational facility. Stores stocked with merchandise, restaurants with fresh food under heat lamps, even a movie theater with current films listed on the marquee. But there were no employees, no customers, no indication that anyone had ever used these facilities. The cash registers were full of money, the food was fresh and warm, and the merchandise was perfectly arranged. It was as if the entire city had been built and stocked for inhabitants who had never arrived. Carlos tried the phones in several businesses, but none had dial tones. The computers were running, but couldn't connect to the internet. Even the ATMs were functional, but dispensed currency that Carlos didn't recognize. Bills that looked like American money, but featured presidents and landmarks he'd never seen. Outside the mall, Carlos explored more of the city. Every building was accessible, every facility was operational, but everything was completely abandoned. He found hospitals with clean operating rooms and stocked medical supplies, schools with lesson plans written on blackboards, and residential neighborhoods with houses that looked lived in, but contained no residents. Most disturbing was the city's infrastructure. Everything worked perfectly: electricity, water, street lighting, traffic control systems. But there were no power plants, no water treatment facilities, no utility buildings of any kind. The city was somehow functioning without any visible means of support. Carlos tried to call his dispatcher from various locations throughout the city, but his phone still showed no signal. He returned to his truck and attempted to leave New Esperanza, but discovered that all the exit ramps led back into the city. No matter which direction he drove, he ended up circling through the same empty streets. As evening approached, Carlos became increasingly desperate. He'd been driving for hours and was running low on fuel, but every gas station in New Esperanza was operational and fully stocked. The pumps accepted his credit card and dispensed fuel normally, but the transactions felt surreal, given the complete absence of any other customers or employees. That night, Carlos slept in his truck parked outside a hotel. The building was unlocked and fully furnished, but Carlos couldn't bring himself to sleep inside a place that felt so fundamentally wrong. He kept his truck running and his doors locked, listening to the eerie silence of a city designed for millions, but inhabited by no one. The next morning, Carlos made a disturbing discovery. During the night, someone or something had restocked all the businesses he'd visited the previous day. Food that he'd eaten from restaurant buffets had been replaced. Merchandise he'd moved had been returned to its original position. And even the gas he'd pumped had somehow been replenished in the station's tanks. Carlos began to suspect that New Esperanza was some kind of trap or test facility. But for what purpose? The city was too elaborate and expensive to be a government experiment, too perfect to be a movie set, and too real to be a hallucination. On his second day in the city, Carlos noticed something new. The traffic lights had begun changing in patterns that seemed to follow his movements. When he approached an intersection, the light would turn green just as he arrived. When he wanted to turn, the appropriate arrow would illuminate. It was as if the city's infrastructure was responding to his presence. Carlos also discovered that the city was much larger than it had appeared from the highway. His truck's odometer showed he'd driven over 200 kilometers through New Esperanza's streets, yet he'd only scratched the surface of the metropolitan area. The city seemed to extend indefinitely in all directions, with new neighborhoods and business districts appearing around every corner. On the third day, Carlos found something that nearly broke his sanity. In the city's central business district, he discovered a building directory that listed Interstate 86 Monitoring Station, floor 47. Carlos took the elevator to the 47th floor and found a facility filled with monitors showing various sections of Interstate 86. The screens displayed real-time footage of the highway Carlos had been driving, including his own truck in New Esperanza. But they also showed dozens of other vehicles scattered along different sections of Interstate 86. Trucks, cars, motorcycles, all apparently lost on the same impossible highway. One monitor showed a family in an RV who appeared to have been traveling Interstate 86 for weeks, living off supplies from empty towns similar to New Esperanza. Another screen displayed a convoy of military vehicles that seemed to be searching for an exit that didn't exist. Carlos realized that Interstate 86 was a trap that captured travelers and deposited them in empty cities throughout the American Southwest. The highway existed in a parallel dimension or alternate reality where infrastructure was built but never populated. On his fourth day in New Esperanza, Carlos discovered the exit. While exploring the city's outskirts, he found a simple dirt road that led back to the desert. No signs, no on-ramps, just a gap in the city's boundary that opened onto familiar Arizona landscape. Carlos drove through the gap and found himself back on legitimate Arizona highways. His GPS immediately recalibrated, showing his correct location on State Route 86 near Tucson. According to his truck's clock, only 4 hours had passed since he'd taken the detour, despite spending what felt like 4 days in New Esperanza. Carlos completed his delivery to El Paso, but couldn't stop thinking about his experience. He researched Interstate 86 and found no official records of such a highway in Arizona, but he discovered online forums where other travelers described similar experiences. Highways that appeared during detours, cities that existed but were never populated, and infrastructure that operated without any visible means of support. Carlos never encountered Interstate 86 again, but he changed his driving habits permanently. He now refuses to take detours recommended by GPS devices, always carries paper maps as backup, and maintains communication with his dispatcher every hour when driving through remote areas. Sometimes, when Carlos is driving through the Arizona desert at night, he watches for the blue-green glow of impossible vegetation and the distant lights of cities that shouldn't exist. He knows that somewhere out there, Interstate 86 is still capturing travelers and leading them to places that exist in the spaces between reality and the infrastructure of modern America.